The title is Outline because it's just going to give you a very brief outline, and I'm going to try to emphasize those aspects of Japanese history that you will hear more about. For instance, the sword drawing. It's very much connected to the samurai culture, so I will outline that for you, but ultimately Dr. Vulcan will talk more about it. I will mention Okinawa and the islands surrounding Okinawa as the birthplace of karate, but again, Dr. Vulcan will give you more on that particular martial art. Right? So keep that in mind as you're going as you're going through this course. I also see Japan in a sort of comparative fashion. So you're going to hear something about Chinese influences, which were taken in or rejected. There are some indigenous Japanese traditions. We're going to talk about that, Shintoism in particular. So, but you will see, much like in the context of China, there's a lot of different traditions that meet and ultimately result in some of the martial arts that come out of Japan. So that just as a sort of background. I also structure my course, I'm very much influenced by a French historian by the name of Fernand Braudel. You need to write that down. But he basically structures history into three major blocks. The first block is a history that is very much a history that we as human beings cannot perceive. It's a history of the mountains, it's a history of the islands, as in Japan. It's a history that seemingly in our lifetime doesn't change. It's also a history that very much influences how human beings live. Just to give you a little bit of facts here, Japan is over 6,000 islands. Okay, 6,000 islands. Let me put up a map here so you get a better reference point. Thousands of islands, but they're really just four major ones. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that, about the creation of Japan and how that influences Japanese history. And then I'm going to shift to a middle layer that Fernand Braudel talks about, which are cycles, human cycles. He talks mostly about the economy. I'm not going to mention so much about it, but I'm going to talk about Japanese culture in very broad strokes. Again, it's an outline. What I'm not going to talk too much about, just towards the end of the lecture, is the last layer, which is really the diplomatic and political historical layer. And there just isn't enough time to cover 2,000 years. So you get a little bit of that, especially for the 19th and 20th century. But most of what you will be hearing is geography, geology, as the first sort of overarching theme of the Japanese islands. So I'm going to talk a lot about the geography of Japan. And you're going to learn a lot about the culture of Japan. So those are the two major parts. And if there's a little bit of time, I'm going to stop at the end, and if you have more questions, then we can talk about it. Or in the case of the samurai sword drawings, I'm just going to refer you to Dr. Vulcan, who is going to give you a much more detailed lecture about this episode. So let's get started. What do we know about Japan? Well, to present you with a comparative figure here, the Japanese islands are the equivalent of almost California. Okay, so if you're looking at equivalent size, it's, California is a big state, and that's about the same size as Japan. Europeans thought of California as an island. It really isn't. It's part of a peninsula, right, when you're going to Baja California, but the Japanese islands are islands, and that creates a very unique, if you like, geography and geology. The best way to visualize Japan is to talk a little bit about the Pacific. Okay? The Pacific is the largest geographical feature on Earth. It covers roughly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. There's so much space in the Pacific that you can take every single continent from the Earth, put them in the Pacific, and you still have room. That's how vast it is. Just to give you a couple of examples, if you fly from LA to, let's say, Sydney, Australia, that's about a 15-hour flight. If you fly to Shanghai from LA, similar, 14, 15 hours, just giving you an idea of how long it would take to cross the Pacific in an airplane. The Japanese islands, of course, are not located in the middle of the Pacific, but they're located very close to the Eurasian continent, really the Asian continent, but you know that Europe is part of that. So, and that indicates that the Japanese islands are of fairly recent origin. And when I say fairly recent, I'm talking about the entire time period of the world. Okay, so because the Japanese islands split off the Eurasian landmass somewhere between 15 to 20 million years ago. And that's fairly recent when we talk about geological times, when we talk about billions of years. Okay? The reason why the Japanese islands are splitting off, and they still are, moving away from the Asian continent at about the speed of a fingernail. Okay? So it doesn't seem like a lot of speed, but if you don't cut your fingernails for a couple of months, you can see that it's actually quite a considerable speed. And the reason why this is happening is because you got this thing called plate tectonics going on underneath. I'm not going to go into the details. You can take geology courses. They explain this much better than I can. But basically, most of the interior of the Earth is magma. You know, and basically, this magma leads to the drift of continents. And that's why the first person to notice this was a German around the earlier 20th century, Wegener, who basically said, look, South America and Africa, when you put them together, fit as a puzzle piece, right? A similar thing can be said about this little indent and Madagascar. So he was one of the first, and everybody laughed at him because they didn't have a mechanism. It wasn't really until World War II, much of it has to do with Japanese and German submarines that people were hunting after, that people started to realize that you know, there's a mid-Atlantic rift. There's some sort of mountain range on the bottom of the ocean, and this rift really indicates that there is some sort of drift going on. Because of this drift, you have a very dangerous zone in the Pacific known as the Ring of Fire. As the name indicates, this is a zone that is very much characterized by volcanic activity, because you actually have you know, a lot of volcanoes around here. But you also have another activity that is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, which is, of course, earthquakes. And we know this from California. We've all felt them. We are kind of sitting there and hoping the big one will not hit in our lifetime, or lifetime of our children and children. So California is a little bit of a gamble, right? You know, all of this combination of climate change and the Ring of Fire makes California a very interesting state to live in.
We should say we don't want to have another big one, and we don't want to have the really, really big one.
Right, that's right.
We had two big ones.
We did. Northridge.
Northridge and then the Santa Cruz one.
Right. The Santa Cruz Island one?
No, Santa Cruz,
Oh,
California.
right. Because that one was just a few years ago that had a pretty big one off Santa Cruz Island.
They had one in the islands, yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, cut a long story short, all of this is part of the Ring of Fire. A lot of movement going on. It affects us, but it also affects, of course, the islands of Japan. Just to give you another statistical fact here, there are more than 100 active volcanoes in the Japanese islands. Over 100. That's a lot. Okay. We also have a few in the United States. Yellowstone supposedly is just simmering below the surface, and if that one breaks out,
we're all dead.
yeah, you know, sometimes when you talk about this history, it gets very depressing. So, okay, let's move away.
Shasta is also a volcano.
Yeah, so, but, you know, obviously Japan is also affected by earthquakes. It's affected by tsunamis. There was a very recent tsunami, several recent tsunamis, of course, that devastated certain regions off the Japanese coast. And it also is a major threat to nuclear power plants that you have a lot in Japan. And here's another interesting fact. Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources, and that's vital to understand, especially Japan in the 19th and 20th century, why Japan would expand into other regions of the world. There's only one resource, again, very much related to plate tectonics and to the volcanic activity, and that is coal. Japan has a lot of coal. Okay, and that's of course important to explain why Japan in the 19th century was able to industrialize so fast, so quickly, and catch up with the United States, other European countries, and would ultimately also join, if you like, the club of the imperialist by the time we enter the 20th century. So much just about, you know, how geology kind of influences human life. The other thing, if you know a little bit about Japan, I don't know how many of you have visited Japan. Okay. What do you think about the population? Is it very dense, densely populated?
There's a lot of people in the city, but it's not like you're like, you know, tuna packed unless you're in like the heart of the city.
Right.
It just depends which city you're in.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Japan, and you said this nicely, much like China, is home to some of the major, biggest cities of the world. The Tokyo metropolitan area is about 40 million. The population of Japan currently is around 125 million. And the tendency is going down. It's interesting because Japan, unlike other countries, has a zero or declining birth rate. And that has a lot to do also with you know, prosperity that you have, especially in post-World War II Japan.
So you're saying that Japan has about 40% of the population of the United States in the size of a place that's the size of California?
Yes,
Wow.
very good.
That's very dense.
That is very dense. And the reason for this is most of Japan, and this has to do with, of course, the movement of the plates, is very mountainous. Okay, so you don't have a lot of space for the population. And here another statistic, only about 16% of the Japanese islands can be used to practice agriculture. Again, another pressure on the population there. And that's because when you're looking at Japan, and this picture kind of illustrates that nicely, is it's very mountainous, okay, extremely mountainous. So that mountains can be used for agriculture, but it's much more difficult to do so. So it concentrates really on two major plains, the Kanto plain. That's where we get the traditional city of Edo, better known as Tokyo today. And the other major plain is right here, that is the Yamato plain. And that's where you get some other major cities of Japan, Kyoto and Osaka. Okay, and it's here where most of the agriculture is practiced and where you get also the concentration of the population. Now these mountains, on one hand, make it in some ways also that it's not an easy country to travel in. Okay, and that also puts some barriers to control the islands, all of them, and fighting, because fighting in mountains is not as easy as fighting in the plains. So some of the major battles will usually take place in the Kanto or Yamato plains, especially when you have large armies coming. The other thing that is important is that Japan has a lot of rivers, but most of these rivers, and this is what a Dutch engineer said in the 16th century, this is not a river, this is a waterfall. Right? And that says something about it, that you can't really navigate many of the Japanese rivers. You can now, but not in the past, because, you know, obviously, you know, engineers have straightened the rivers. Most of the rivers really come straight down from the mountains and are not the best way to use for navigation. So consequently, the best way to travel around Japan is going overland, but since Japan is made up of major islands, and I'm going to talk about the islands here in a little bit. Another good way to travel in Japan is using the so-called island sea. And that is a sea between different islands. Okay, let me give you the names of the islands here. Again, this is the island sea. You have the southern island of Kyushu, the main island of Honshu, and the smaller islands of Shikoku. Again, you don't have to remember all of this. Just remember the main islands of Honshu, this one, and Kyushu as the southernmost islands. Okay, so, but there's thousands of islands in the Japanese archipelago. These are just some examples of the major ones. And it is here in the inland sea that you actually have a lot of communication. So you use the inland sea to communicate between these three major islands. And it's also here where the Japanese would learn how to navigate and to ultimately leave the Japanese islands and go across the Tsushima Straits, located right here. Only 100 miles separate the islands of Japan from the Korean peninsula. It's a very narrow strait, but it's also a very rough strait. Keep that in mind. A very strategic and rough strait, because it's through here that most of the early influences come to Japan, mostly from China. And it's also through here that the Mongols, under not Genghis Khan, under Kublai Khan, will ultimately try to invade the Japanese islands twice, and twice will fail. Again, you will ultimately have, we'll talk more about this, an encounter between samurai and Mongols that will go the samurai way, also because of environmental impact. Should I say, should I give a shameless plug? Shameless plug. If you're interested in environmental history, geographic history, and how the environment forms human history, we are offering next year a course of environmental history. So, again, I believe it's one of the, again, I'm biased here, it's one of the most important forms of history to emerge in the last 20 years. It's a new form of history, but there is a danger, of course, that what I'm telling you here becomes determining of Japanese culture. I mean, obviously, culture will react to the environment, but is not bound by the environment. So just keep that in mind, okay? Couple of things that you should also know, because Japan has so many active volcanoes, you also have a lot of hot springs. And these hot springs will also become part of Japanese culture. And this is, for instance, when Westerners and Japanese first meet, it wasn't a nice meeting because the Japanese basically felt that the Westerners, for good reason, didn't smell too good. Because they didn't have a culture of cleanliness. And the Portuguese and the Spanish who kept arriving in the 1500s, bearded, sunburned, looked like barbarians, really, in their view. Because they didn't take the same kind of care of their bodies as the Japanese would. But again, it also has a lot to do with hot springs being abundant and easy to get to. So they become also part of Japanese culture. So, anything else I should say? We talked about the plains, we talked about the mountains, we talked about the difficulty of arable land. Let me just say one more thing. Most of the early cultural influences will use the shortest way to get to Japan, through the Tsushima Strait, right here. So you get a lot of Chinese influences, especially coming into Japan early on. Later on, the main opening to the world will be the port of Nagasaki, and it is here that we get the Western influences. First Spanish and Portuguese, later Dutch. Okay. So, and again, this is also very important to remember. When you talk about Japanese culture, it is often important to remind us of some mythological beginnings, stories about mythological beings. We all have creation stories. Every society around the world has creation stories. But in Japan, it's very important because here we see the birth of what is later known as the Shinto religion. Shinto is a religion that, like many other religions around the world, believes that many things have spirits, have souls. And there are different types of gods in Shinto religion, so it's polytheistic. It believes in many different gods. And I should say we are here in a tradition in the United States where monotheism is taken for granted. But monotheism, I should say, especially historically speaking, is an exception, not the rule. Okay, just keep that in mind. So in order to understand, I'm not going to talk about all of the deities. I don't have time. Speaking about Shintoism would, of course, take hours. I tried to look for something useful on YouTube. And, you know, there's a lot of videos on Shinto creation myths, but they're all pretty bad. So I'm just going to do it for you. I'm just not understanding why nobody makes it. This would be a very interesting video that one could show because it's a fascinating story. So, like many creation stories, it starts with the notion that at the beginning there's nothing. There is darkness. And out of the darkness comes light, life, springs life. There's several generations of gods that emerge early on in this belief system, but in the seventh generation, again I'm jumping over here, you have the emergence of a brother and a sister who become central to the creation of the Japanese idols. The brother's name, represented right here, is Izanagi. His younger sister, Izanami. Izanagi, Izanami. And as this woodcut from the 19th century, again, most of the representation we get from these mythological beings emerge in later times. And I'm going to talk about this, why the Shinto religion takes a while to actually take root. This is a representation of the 19th century, and this is a particular spear that Izanagi uses to steer the waters in the Sea of Japan. And out of the steering of the waters emerges land, the Japanese islands. It's the creation here. Again, this is not an unusual story because in a lot of islands in the Pacific, we get this too. If you watch, for instance, the Disney version, I'm cringing here, of Moana, and this demigod Maui, he kind of fishes the island out of the sea. So this is not an unusual thing. So we see this pattern here as well. Now, Izanagi and Izanami, and this might sound weird to us, but in creation myths this is not weird, are actually married to each other. And as they are partners, they also have offspring. And these offspring become gods in the Shinto world. Izanami, however, becomes very much exhausted by all of this creation, whether land or gods, that when she gives birth to a particular deity, a fire god, she gets so badly burned and exhausted that she lies dying. Izanagi tends to her, tries to save her, but ultimately fails. She passes away and goes to the underworld. Izanagi is distraught. His sister, his partner, is gone. He wants to bring her back. So he decides to travel to the underworld to bring her back to the world of the living. He goes there and he sees her in the underworld, a very distant corner of the underworld, and he doesn't see her. It's dark, so he cannot really fully see her, and he's happy to see her again, and he says, "Izanami, come with me." And she says, "No, I can't. I have eaten the food of the underworld, and I have to undergo a ritual process of cleansing. I have to wait a period until I can re-emerge." So Izanagi says, "Fine, I will wait for you." So he sits at the entrance of the underworld, waiting, and waiting some more. She doesn't come. So he becomes impatient. As he is impatient, he walks back into the underworld and can't find her. He's distraught. So distraught that he lights a fire. And as he lights the fire, he sees her in a corner, covering in a corner. And he realizes that she is already decaying, that her body is not the same, that decay has taken root of her. He becomes so disgusted by the sight of her that he decides to flee, that he decides to leave the underworld. Izanami is upset at him. She says, "I told you to wait. The period is not over. You violated our agreement." So she becomes very angry at him and sends mythological beings after him that she creates. In a Western context, we would call these mythological creatures witches, evil creatures that want to do harm. So they chase after Izanagi. And in this process, Izanagi, again, it's a creation story, tries to prevent these individuals from catching up to him. So he takes his comb from his hair and he flings it into the ground. Out of this comb come the first bamboo to basically prevent the witches from catching up with him. Which, of course, bamboo in the bamboo forest, these beautiful bamboo forests that you see often, also when you go to Huntington and you go to the Japanese gardens there, very beautiful stuff. He keeps on running. Again, the witches almost catch up with him. So he decides to create another barrier. This time he urinates against the walls of the underworld. Out of his own urine come the first rivers of Japan. Again, they slow the witches down, but not enough. They're almost catching up with him. But Izanagi, being divine, reaches the end of the underworld, and there they cannot fall. And as he is in the underworld, he's so traumatized by this encounter that he decided that he needs ritual cleansing. So he steps into one of these hot springs, of the many hot springs that you have in Japan, and out of this ritual cleansing, more gods are born. Okay, also tears from his eyes, since this is such a traumatic experience that he has. All of this become creation. And I'm not going to go into detail which gods are created. There's only one that is really central to this story. And that is the sun goddess. The sun goddess. The goddess of the sun. Her name is Amaterasu. Amaterasu. She is born out of this ritual cleansing that Izanagi is undergoing. Amaterasu is the sun goddess. And the belief here is that the sun goddess serves as the original ancestors to all the emperors of Japan. And this is very important. The emperors of Japan are believed to be, at least until recently, until World War II, to be divine, or at least partially divine. This is very different from the Chinese context, keep that in mind again, where the Chinese emperor gets the mandate of heaven. He is not divine. He just gets the mandate of heaven and can lose it. But in the Japanese context, Amaterasu serves as the direct ancestor to all the emperors of Japan. Now, that is mythological creation story. What we do know about Shintoism and the beliefs of Shintoism probably came about shortly after the year 0, when one very prominent faction in Japan emerged in one of the plains, one of the major plains that I talked about, that is known as the Yamato plain. It is here that a prominent clan arose, the Yamato clan, named after the particular plain, that would ultimately seek to, for the first time, unite all the Japanese islands under one central authority. To cut a long story short, they wouldn't quite attain that aim, but they were some of the first to set out to do this aim. A couple of things that we see also. The first sort of representations that we get of Japanese often have them riding on horsebacks. The horses were imported from China. Again, they came from China. And many of the first sources we have about Japan are Chinese sources. But it's during Yamato Japan that for the first time we have indigenous Japanese sources actually talking about this. And also rendering the creation story of Izanagi and Izanami on paper for the first time. Now, Yamato Japan is one of these beginnings and how Japanese culture starts to form. During other periods that follow, especially the so-called Heian periods, we have the full formation of what Japanese belief systems are. And what is interesting about Japan, there's always a component of accepting or rejecting Chinese influences. Okay. During the Heian period, we have the establishment of the emperors of Japan, known as Tenno, the heavenly sovereign, and because of the belief in Shintoism, they are partially divine. There is this divine link. They're not the son of heaven in the Chinese context, they are divine. They are. During the Heian period, we also have the establishment of the major warrior class, that you would find in Japan. These individuals would ultimately be called samurai. One of the major influences that Japan has throughout its history is China. China, of course, it's just across the Tsushima Strait. I mean, really, you're in the Korean peninsula, but that becomes the corridor of major Chinese influences. And it's especially during the Tang Dynasty that a lot of influences make their way across. Most of these influences are Confucianism and Buddhism that come in different forms across the Tsushima Strait. Confucianism, especially in the Chinese context, emphasizes that rank within the administration is based on merit. Okay? And that is one of the major contributions of Confucianism, is actually also a legacy of Confucianism to Western culture. You know, that you have to take the thing that you're doing now, take notes, take exams. This is all based that you ultimately will have a better life, that you can move through the ranks. So this is a major heritage of Confucianism. The other thing, however, in the Japanese context, is that Confucianism was important, and merit was important, but in the Japanese context, birth is equally important. Okay? So it's not just merit, it's also birth. And that's partially related to the emperor, who of course is divine. And the emperor is not based on merit, as in a Chinese context, but is based on birth. And from this also comes a very interesting contrast that will become more pronounced as we move into the 19th, 20th century. In China, from a Japanese perspective, the emperor is seen as the emperor of the sunset, or if you want, the emperor of the dying sun. In Japan, the emperor, and of course his connection to Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, he is the emperor of the sunrise, or of the birthing sun. And often this is often represented, of course, in flags, especially imperial Japanese flags that we all know from World War II movies. Okay? Major contrast. Emperor of the sunset, emperor of the sunrise. So, some other influences, I don't have too much time to go into it. We see that some of the planning, especially architectural planning, comes over from China, and some of the major cities that you have emerging between the 8th and the 12th century are very much inspired by some of the architecture that you find in China. The rise of the warrior class. Again, you know, I'm not spending a whole lot of time here on all the different cultural implications, but what you have here, of course, and this is important to just mention this briefly, is the formation of Japanese culture. That includes art, poetry, literature, because all of this develops during this particular time period. For our class here, since it is an Asian warrior class, after all, we need to emphasize the rise of a particular warrior class that we ultimately know as the samurai. So there's a number of reforms that happened between the 8th and the 12th century. And these reforms are collectively known as the Taika reforms. You know, have to remember, I'm not going to ask you this on the exam, but I'm going to play a little video for you to talk about what kind of reforms these are and why you have the rise of the warrior class. Most importantly, as a consequence of these reforms, you have the creation of local elites that will become increasingly more powerful. So let me play this for you. It's not muted, it is on. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about, or let's do YouTube, do a little bit of talk.
Of Honshu, Japan's main island. This permanent settlement soon gave birth to a political state based on military might and taxation paid in the form of rice.
Rice is a labor-intensive way of getting food out of the ground. And it's also a way of getting food out of the ground that makes you very committed to a place. If you're doing slash and burn agriculture, you can up and move. If you're building an elaborate irrigation system and then growing rice on it, you've put years of labor into a spot and you need to farm it for years to get the value of your labor back. And this makes it very easy to tax people. They're less inclined to up and run away.
Groups of extended families called clans began to struggle for dominance of the Yamato plain. Small armies soon formed, supported largely by taxes collected from farmers. The history of this period is vague, but eventually one group, who took its name from the area in which it lived, made the right combination of strategic alliances to come out on top, the Yamato clan. They rose to dominance sometime in the 6th century. The Yamatos declared their successive leaders emperors and supported this move by also claiming divine origin. Their empire gradually widened as they conquered territories in neighboring regions of Honshu. Perhaps the most well-known figure from this family was a bigger-than-life warrior named Yamato Takeru no Mikoto. better known as Prince Yamato.
He was basically a mythical figure, a sort of Hercules sort of character that's invented as part of this growing political mythology. He's noted for a number of exploits. In the story, he sort of single-handedly travels about Japan, subduing various rebellious tribes and individual leaders.
Prince Yamato's fearless and daring behavior, mythical or not, became an archetype for future Japanese warriors.
In the middle of the 7th century, these so-called emperors had accumulated enough power, enough control over at least the central parts of the main Japanese island in order to impose a political reform.
In this reform, the imperial family set up a central government with a palace and a court of nobles, councillors, and government administrators at the site of present-day Kyoto. To provide the nobles with income, imperial lands were divided and distributed among them. Income came from taxes, usually in the form of rice, paid by peasant farmers who worked the lands. But it was the responsibility of the nobles themselves to protect their lands and collect taxes. This could be especially difficult if a nobleman's property lay hundreds of miles from Kyoto.
You have to form kind of a private army to make sure that the peasants are properly taxed and that you receive your income. Otherwise, there may be robbers on the way. You know, there are famines and there are robbers on the way that attack these convoys and they steal all the rice. That is your income.
Manpower for these private armies was often drawn from warrior families living on the edges of the empire. Most were of noble descent. As the noble families in Kyoto had grown in size, many of the younger sons had been forced to the empire's boundaries to conquer new lands for themselves. These men fought from horseback, using the bow and arrow as their primary weapon, and frontier life had made them tough as nails. They became a sort of rural police force for the nobles in Kyoto and were ultimately dubbed samurai, meaning one who serves. In exchange for their services, they demanded parcels of land. This was the true beginning of the samurai tradition.
As more they were in demand, these warriors, the more powerful they became. Why? Because they also had to be paid in land. There was no money, right? And so sometimes the official in Kyoto had to divide his land from which he drew his income into half. One half would be his income, the other half would go for payment of the warriors who secure your whole area militarily.
By the 10th and 11th centuries, the heads of some samurai families controlled huge tracts of land and had become powerful warlords in command of vast armies of warriors. They battled each other for dominance, and it was only a matter of time before one of these strong leaders would attempt to brush the imperial family aside and seize the throne for himself. For coming generations, this grab for power would shape the samurai.
Okay, I'm going to leave you here, 10th, 11th century. The most important thing to remember here is, of course, the rise of this warrior class, the rise of local elites that now start battling each other. And one of the most important elements is that you ultimately will have a split in the Japanese ruling system. On one hand, there's the emperor, who is divine, who sits in Kyoto, and on the other hand, a substitute for the emperor, known, as you probably have heard of, the term the shogun. Okay, the shogun. Let me talk about that briefly. Out of the struggle that you have among the different kind of clans, there emerged a very powerful clan known as the Minamoto clan. And we usually take the inception here to about 1185, so the 12th century after the birth of Christ. And it is this clan that suggested splitting rule in Japan. And this is very important because this doesn't happen in China. I mean, you do have the Emperor of China, and the Emperor of China, of course, has people advising him. But what happens in Japan is that you have split between the sacred and the secular. In other words, between religious leader, who is the emperor, since he is a direct descendant from the sun goddess, and a secular leader that does the everyday control. And this secular leader will become known as the shogun. The shogun. Okay. So, and the shogun would have another government that's not in Kyoto, but is known as the tent government because it moves around a lot. It's also referred to as the bakufu. So you basically have two governments happening in Japan during this particular time period. And it is this figure, the shogun, that will become increasingly more important in Japanese history, especially as we move into the more modern times. Because the notion is, well, you need the emperor is important, the emperor commands the control of the divine, so the emperor needs to sit in Kyoto, and he is responsible for all the Shinto rituals. But the day-to-day affair of running a country, that then falls to the shogun. Okay. This is what some historians, and again I'm putting this in quotation marks because unfortunately this particular time period sometimes is mixed with medieval Europe. So we sometimes call this feudal Japan. But feudalism is of course a concept that comes to us from Europe, so it's not of a whole lot of use here, but it's very similar. The similarity is that you have the two seats of power. You have the emperor, you have the shogun, but really you have the shogun also giving lands to noblemen, and these noblemen are known as the daimyo. Okay. And these noblemen, of course, in return will send armies to support the shogun should the shogun be under attack. But as you can imagine, many of these daimyos had their own design on taking over the bakufu, taking over the shogunate. So you actually have the seed here again of another major civil war that will break out just in time as the Portuguese and the Spanish will arrive. But more about this later. During feudal Japan, during this time period roughly between the 12th and the 15th century, we have many of the roots that will ultimately become known as Japanese culture. It is also during this time that you have the increasing development of the samurai, those who serve. And as the name suggests, the most important attribute of a samurai, of one of these warrior elites, is loyalty. Loyalty above all. Loyalty to your lord, loyalty to your daimyo. If you don't have a lord, then you become a ronin, a masterless samurai, which is not a good thing. Okay? And you've seen many of those movies about this, why people become masterless. Often is not necessarily by choice. So, again, I don't want to talk too much about this because how much, Dr. Vulcan, how much will you talk about the specific samurai culture? And,
I'll talk less about the culture and more about the swords.
Okay.
But I can talk a little bit about the culture too.
Okay. So I'll leave that to him. I'm just going to mention what are some of the most important elements that characterize this warrior culture we know as the samurai in Japan. Again, it is interesting to see that one of the practices that reaches Japan sometime around the 10th century is a particular type of Buddhism that comes via China, where it's known as Chan Buddhism, but it becomes changed in the Japanese context and becomes the very famous Zen Buddhism that will characterize what these samurai are all about. It's about meditation, self-discipline. You do have some book learning, but it's not so much emphasizing on books. It's really on experience, not books. And it's very much what Dr. Vulcan suggested. What we find in the context of the samurai is this predatory aggression, right? The lecture that you gave at the beginning of the semester, the calmness before you spring into action. So this is what is part of this whole samurai's culture. Again, let me just play a little bit about what this means. So you get a feel of what Zen Buddhism is all about. This is less about the samurai and more about the actual practice of Zen Buddhism.
or meditation Buddhism, was introduced to Japan from China in the 1100s. It emphasizes seeking one's own Buddha nature through meditation. These monks live at Tofukuji in Kyoto, one of Japan's oldest Zen temples. Every chore, no matter how routine, is undertaken with mindfulness, staying in the present rather than letting the mind wander to past or future. The monks line up to meet with the abbot. They will discuss koans, paradoxical problems that cannot be solved through rational thought. The process of working on the koan, for months, even years, will open the disciple's mind to new levels of awareness. Monks spend much of their day in meditation and rarely sleep more than 4 hours a night. The head monk's strike is not a punishment, but an aid to meditation. It revives the monk and may even shock him into greater awareness. Meals are taken with complete mindfulness on the food and the ritual use of the bowls and utensils. Not a drop is wasted. After cleaning the temple, the monks venture out to beg for alms. In the old days, people gave rice or other offerings of food. These days, it's more common to give cash. Some monks train as calligraphers, painters, or gardeners. Paintings depict famous Zen sayings in calligraphy, or Bodhidharma, the founder of Zen Buddhism. Rock gardens symbolize mountainous landscapes, the ideal retreat for monastic life. From the origins of Buddhism in India to the development of schools in China, Korea, and Japan, meditation Buddhism has transcended language and culture. Over the past 50 years, Zen has gained many new followers outside of Asia. The pursuit of mental focus and the benefits of meditation appeal to people in search of meaning in a rapidly changing world.
Buddhism is in the modern context. Think about this transformed into the samurai culture. What does this do? Obviously, live in the present, not the past, the future. It makes you ready for combat and also ready to accept the result of this combat. So it is very much what Dr. Volkan talked about, this predatory aggressiveness, the calmness. You enter the battle calm. So you're able to react better. You're not emotional.
Yes. Remind me,
Sure.
Let me say a little bit when I'm talking about sword stuff. What part of it is like Buddhism and what part is not like Buddhism? Because in my opinion, I don't think the samurai really are Buddhists.
Okay.
They practice Zen, but they don't practice Zen Buddhism.
Okay.
So I'll talk a little bit about that. So somebody remind me.
Okay. Do you want to say a few words?
Well, just that if you're a Buddhist, you basically take a vow not to hurt other beings. And samurai use the Zen concentration to develop more efficient ways of killing people.
Okay.
That's it in a nutshell.
Yes, but at the same time, you also have fighting monks in China, right? So the defend.
Also, we could claim that they are, at some
Okay,
point,
all
not
right.
adhering to the principles of Buddhism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a few things about the swords, since we have them up there?
They're very, very sharp. Incredibly sharp. That's the main thing you need to know about them. If somebody is around you with a real samurai sword, or even one that is a semi-sharp samurai sword, you should treat that as if it's like a piece of radioactive metal, and keep your distance, because literally the blade is so sharp that you can't see with the naked eye. And we'll talk about how they make that. I'll go into that in detail about that.
As a matter of fact, what you also have the development with this, and again, I leave this to Dr. Volkan, is an incredible metallurgy skill, how these swords are made and folded several times over to become really, the katana is really the soul.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah,
you
that's
don't
the
lose
other
that.
thing to say, yes.
You know, and again, that would probably not be very Buddhism. That would be more animistic, in the
Yes.
sense that more
Very,
Shintoism.
very much, yeah.
But it is you. Your sword becomes you.
And maybe it's my imagination, but I've had the good fortune in my life to encounter, like, close up, you know, a few very old real samurai swords, and I swear you feel as if it has a presence. But maybe that's just, I won't say it's scientific, but when you start thinking about the soul and the sword, and you see one up close, you know, it starts to make sense.
Absolutely. In some ways, this is not unique. I mean, in some ways, in some traditions, you have this also in Ottoman tradition. You have this in Western tradition that you know, there's certain types of swords that are associated with people. I mean, that's why you still have museum pieces, because there's the sort of notion that somebody very famous handled this particular piece. So there's some sort of sympathetic magic that goes
Call
on.
it mojo.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it.
Mojo.
You know, I mean, again, I want to mention voodoo, but voodoo is a religion that very much works on the principle that stuff of you becomes you. That's why you can have a voodoo doll, so a fingernail, a hair, actually becomes part of you. And the similar things is going on here, that part of you transfers into the samurai swords, and the swords transfer to you as well. So the other thing, again, Dr. Volkan will tell you more about what the process is, how long it takes to manufacture one of these swords. It's months and months, if not years. A lengthy process to make this. You have expert swordsmakers. Interestingly, these expert swordsmakers were also the first one to make muskets, as they would arrive from the Portuguese and the Spanish, so their skills could be applied to make other weapons as well. You have different kind of swords. The reason why you have long and not so long swords is the nature of where you do the fighting. Dr. Volkan will tell you about that too. I mean, if you fight in the open, the long sword is great, but if you're inside of a house, you don't want to use the long sword because you might get stuck. So you have a shorter sword for this close range indoor fighting. It's similar to, I guess, Jeet Kune Do, where one sword doesn't fit all the situation, but you have several.
Yeah, and the other thing is that it was considered to be impolite to bring your longsword into the house.
Absolutely.
But you didn't want to go in and not have a weapon. So the short sword does a lot of those little kinds of things.
Absolutely. And then you want to talk about the really short one.
The really short one is a knife, it's a tanto. So the big one's the katana, the smaller one is the wakizashi, and the short one, the knife, is a tanto. And again, the tantos are just as sharp as the swords. If you want to collect these, by the way, you can find original tantos and wakizashis for much cheaper than the katanas. So you want to buy original katana, they're hard to find, you know, they're very expensive, but you can get a very nice tanto, you know, that's originally, you know, it's got a real blade and everything for, you know, probably $1,000, you know.
How much would be a katana?
Katana, I was in Japan, and there were some that they were telling me that were fairly old, 1800s, and they wanted about 6,000 to 7,000, but they weren't a famous maker. Older ones, you know, they'll go 10,000, 20,000, 40, 50, you know, depending on, some are priceless. They're hard, they're not allowed to really be, there's some import or export restrictions in Japan on these things, because after the war, World War II, a lot of American soldiers were taking these things as souvenirs and bringing them back. And I've heard horror stories, they bring them back like, oh, I need to sharpen this thing, and they put them on a grinder wheel, you know, like, I actually know a guy who's got one that's been destroyed that way. It was an ex-serviceman sword. And so the Japanese government put restrictions on exporting them.
Exactly.
They're national treasures. You know, there are still makers. I'll talk all about this. There's still people making them. I'll talk all about this stuff.
Awesome, awesome. So yes, so samurai. Again, influences, outside influences, but also you see the influences of Shintoism. You know, the spirituality that you have here. But you also see the influence of Buddhism as to prepare the warrior before the battle. So lots of different influences that come together here. The central text, even if I said that the samurais are not necessarily book-driven, there's a central, and it's really more than a book, it's a code that the samurai live and die by. This particular code is known as the Bushido. And again, the last term, part of this word, do, is probably Tao, right? Because Bushido translates, here it says the warrior code, but it's also better translated as the way of the warrior. The way of the warrior. And again, it shows outside influences because what you have here is Taoism coming in. Okay.
But that won't often be, a lot of times Japanese martial artists won't cop to that. They'll say this is not, doesn't come from anywhere, it's our own indigenous.
Oh, okay.
thing.
So what do you think?
Oh, I think definitely it has flavors of Taoism. Because Taoism also arises from a shamanic tradition. And so they come up, and so the idea that you have a separate shamanic tradition in Japan and China when they're so close together, yes, it's possible, but it's also possible there could have been a lot of interchange. And likely there was, I think there was quite likely a lot.
Yeah, I think so too. Again, I'm not an expert, but I would say the way of, you know, and Taoism, as you nicely explained, is a very flexible belief system that accommodates very well.
And Zen Buddhism includes a lot of Taoism.
Absolutely.
So even later influences. But I will say Shintoism in Japan has its own flavor.
It does.
You know, the idea that the world is inhabited by spirits, that's not alien to the Chinese Taoists. They would be fine with that. But the way the Japanese really, you know, they really upplayed that part of it. And so they do have a sort of, I think, a unique presentation of it. You know, and maybe that's because they're an island nation. You know, it needs to be related to that. But I do think they probably have some.
Definitely. I mean, much can be said about the Bushido, and you have a reading, very interesting, what is it, Bushido Bull, the title of the reading that you have for this week, because Carl Friday, who is a major expert on the samurai, believes that taking this Bushido code into World War II is sometimes exaggerated, and it becomes, you know, this Hollywood portrayal of what Bushido is all about.
So that, I mean, that might be worth a discussion. And I'd be curious what you think about this, because really what happens in Japan is, and you're going to talk about this, the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class has sort of gotten rid of. By the time World War II comes around, it's very useful to sort of, for these nationalists in Japan, to push this samurai myth to people.
Right.
That, okay, we're these samurai, we're these warriors, you know, and the samurai myth gets brought back. And then it sort of applies into everybody in Japan. Is where previously, my understanding is the samurai class was relatively small compared to the rest of the population.
Absolutely.
Only a few percent. But then you start in World War II, we're all going to be samurai, you're going to have conscript army, all like adopting samurai principles, being samurai. And even after World War II, when you talk about the Japanese business,
right,
you know, miracle, Japanese coming back after World War II and creating a, you know, one of the world powers in business and finance. You know, again, the salarymen, you know, the corporations, they adopt this samurai mentality, which is basically to work yourself to death, which is what they do. And so that's a, in a way, it's kind of a perversion of the samurai mentality. And in another way, I think it actually fits very well. I don't know what you think about that, but that's my...
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the best point you made is this applies to a very small percentage of the population, and all of a sudden, by the time you move into the 20th century, you have to apply this to the conscript armies that you see that will ultimately fight first, of course, against China, then against Russia, Germany, and ultimately against the U.S. in the Pacific. That's it's best known from. It's sort of there's a transition there that doesn't quite fit, but. And some of the problems we have is that the U.S. government, in order to understand what the Japanese are all about, commissioned anthropologists who were not Japanese, really, who were anthropologists studying the Japanese, to write books about this, you know, to understand this. One of the main principles of the Bushido is this absolute loyalty. You have to have loyalty. It's interesting, you know, loyalty is, of course, reminded of our own president, who values loyalty above all. You know, again, that would be a misapplication of Bushido. But it's definitely this sort of notion that You can't jump ship, you know. Things are going bad for you, and you all of a sudden say, oh, I'm just going to switch over to this lord because my lord obviously is losing the battle, and that is a big no-no. You don't do that. That is like the worst thing you can do, according to the Bushido. Having a lord, serving a lord, and that's why, you know, samurais are translated as those who serve. You have to serve. Your goal is to serve. Because this is what is part of you. This is what defines you. Okay? And if you constantly switch ship, then you lose all credibility. You basically lose what makes you, in this context, I'm saying in this context, a man. Okay? So this is part of what Bushido is. But there's also respect. One of the interesting things that is definitely different from World War II, the sort of notion of how prisoners were treated. That supposedly that was part of the Bushido. You don't fall prisoner. And that is not really, this is some sort of altercation that you find, especially during the 20th century. The same thing about not giving up. A desperate situation. I mean, the Japanese had a notion for the garrisons that were overrun by the Americans. They called them crushed jewels. Basically, you know, everybody died to the last man. This is something, of course, again, that's a 20th century invention of what Bushido is all about. Because it's really applied to a very small percentage of the population. You going to talk about this too?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a whole lecture on this.
All right. So I'm not going to talk about this. Of course, part of being a samurai is also knowing when you reach the end. I mean, not all samurai, of course, would die of ritual suicide, known as seppuku. Harikiri is not a nice term. It basically means belly slicing. That is basically not a good term to be used. But frequently, and this is again part of the Bushido, in order to save face, if you have shamed your lord, for instance, for doing something, for instance, jumping ship, for giving up in a particular crucial battle, the only way to make good is by taking your own life. And by doing this seppuku, which basically means you take that knife, the smallest one of the swords that you've seen there, and you will basically introduce it into your belly, and then you will move it, thereby killing yourself. I'm not going to talk too much about it, because what is also very important is you have to have a second. You have to stand somebody over you who basically will lessen the pain of this, and will, at a crucial moment, as you're moving upwards with that little knife, will sever your head. Okay, that's why the seconds are so important. You will also, of course, there's a ritual that you do. You write a haiku before you perform the ceremony, which will basically, where you atone for the sins that you have done. You will drink a cup of sake, but there's also a ritual how you drink it, not very fast, because that shows fear. When you drink it too slow, that shows cowardice. So you have to have it in 2 gulps. Right? 1, 2, done. And for the second, it's very important that they don't sever your head completely, but leave a flap of skin right down here. So the head will cleanly just fall to your chest and not start rolling around.
Yes, we will demonstrate.
He will demonstrate. So all of this is, you know, that's why I want to talk about it. It's cool stuff. He will demonstrate the
It's
real
a
one.
very good technique. You have to have some technique for that. It's
Okay. So he's not going to really chop your head off. This.
Well, I'm doing the chopping.
You're doing it. Okay.
I'll show you guys.
I'm not going to volunteer. So
So
but,
much chopping you real bad.
okay, good. As a matter of fact, you have notified the police, right?
I have notified the police that we will have swords on campus.
Yes. And most of the samurai swords that you will see for the demonstration are not the real sharp
They are
ones.
not sharp swords, yes. They're not very sharp.
Okay, so don't be afraid. Because about, 4 years ago, we failed to notify the campus police.
Yes, they were not happy.
And all of a sudden, all the campus police showed up, and they had gotten a tip that there were crazy people with samurai swords.
Partly it's the zeitgeist of the time.
Right.
Everybody's a little on edge
Right.
about terrorists, and you have migrants coming to the border, so they probably all have samurai swords and, so we need to
Very
there
true.
is a little on edge, unfortunately, so yes, but the police are notified, and the chief actually said he would love to come and watch, so maybe he'll show up.
Okay. So more about this, I'll leave you, because this is obviously also part of a tradition that will ultimately become very much questioned. You're going to see the movie Harakiri.
No, we're going to see another movie.
Oh, you're going to see another movie.
Yeah,
I'm
we're
sorry.
going to see something a little lighter, because we're just done with,
Oh, okay, sorry.
But
Misinformed.
maybe I should bring some clips from Harakiri, so
Okay.
maybe I'll do that.
Because that shows when the samurai class is actually declining and threatening suicide is a way out, but you don't really perform it, somebody will give you money.
So it's been sort of, so what happens, well, anyway, I'll talk about all this stuff. Yeah, remind me. It's all very good.
Okay.
Fascinating stuff.
All right, so as I promised, there will be an encounter between the two warrior traditions that we have already seen in this class. Of course, the Mongols that come from these very nomadic societies and conquering the biggest empire the world up to that point had ever seen. First under Genghis Khan, but his grandsons, of course, would take it over. One of his grandsons is Kublai Khan, who would establish a new dynasty in China known as the Yuan dynasty. That would last until about the mid-14th century, when they would be kicked out of China. But while the Yuan dynasty was at its height, Kublai Khan, of course, demanded more tribute. And one of the places that he turned to, because Japan, and this is quite important, I'm saying that Japan doesn't have a whole lot of resources, but the resources that they have are important. I mentioned coal. Another major resource that Japan had, and I will talk about this a little later, is silver. And that is, of course, a very precious metal. So Kublai Khan and the Mongols set out to conquer the Japanese islands, to take over the silver treasure, and, of course, to take over more territory. The problem, major problem, of course, the Mongols faced is, well, they were great opponents on horseback, great opponents when fighting on the big steppes of Eurasia. Dr. Kobat did such a wonderful job telling you what would happen if a big knight in heavy armor would face these Mongols. They would be, look like a pincushion ultimately, because the Mongols would ride circles around him. Problem with invading Japan is you can't do this on horseback. You really need ships. And you really need a different kind of maritime tradition that the Mongols really didn't have. They borrowed it because there were maritime traditions, of course, that you have in Korea, that you have in China, but you yourself are not really born on this kind of tradition, so it's a different kind of warfare. Once you land in Japan, that's a different issue, because then you can fight again on the beaches and you can fight again on land. That's something you feel good about. But getting to Japan is difficult. They tried twice. In 1274, they sent about 40,000 warriors. When that failed, they decided to up the numbers to 140,000 and do it again in 1281. The Battle of 1281, the Mongols, I'm going to play this for you, say they came very close to winning. But ultimately what would decide this battle will be again the environment. The Strait of Tsushima, this very narrow strait between the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese islands, would turn into a very difficult crossing, made worse by the arrival of a typhoon, a major storm. Also it's hurricane. Hurricane is actually a Caribbean term, a Carib term, one of the few that survived the onslaught of the Europeans, but it would devastate the fleet. So let me show you this. This is a very good movie you're seeing. The only thing that you need to keep in mind is there's not much narration. It has subtitles, and the subtitles are not greatly translated. At one point they even switch out the dates, so 1281 becomes 1821. Whoops. So just keep that in mind, okay, as I'm showing you this. apologize for the subtitles, they're not great. Obviously the invasion was not in 1821, but it really was in 1281, so there's that. But it's an interesting thing because here you also meet different kind of warrior tradition. Dr. Vulcan just asked, what about the gunpowder? Is that accurate? And yes, it is. You have the Mongols actually using forms of gunpowder. They don't have muskets, they don't have cannons, but they have handheld grenades, sort of the forerunners of grenades, and they have these sort of trebuchet items that basically hurl these explosive devices into the Japanese. But you meet two major warrior traditions, and ultimately the one that will prevail are the samurai. Even if they're outmanned and literally outgunned because of the knowledge that the Mongols have, they will prevail, also because of nature. Yes?
How did the Japanese find out the Mongols were trying to come and invade?
I'm sorry.
How did the Japanese find out that the Mongols were trying to come?
Oh yeah, because building a fleet for 140,000 people is not something that you can keep secret. And they're building two. I mean, they're building them, of course, in the Korean Empire. You know, the Japanese have heard of the Mongols. There is cultural interaction. As a matter of fact, Japan, this is not really relevant to this lecture, but one thing, Japan has developed, and I shouldn't say Japan, but the Japanese people have developed a tradition of piracy and smuggling that's going on. And smuggling is not just items that you get from these countries, but it's also smuggling information, hearing information. So the defenders of Japan are very well informed, and they know that this is coming. Lecture, I gave you an introduction to the samurai, the warrior culture of Japan. Clearly there's more warrior traditions that Dr. Vulcan will talk about, especially he will talk about the sword drawing, which is part of the samurai culture, but you also have the development of karate, which basically comes from the, Okinawa and the islands to the south of Japan that have a different story. They're related to Japanese history, but it's also a very different story. So one important episode in the history of Japan, and to understand the history of Japan, is of course the European global expansion. And there is a lot of historical research on this right now. I mean, we're kind of knocking off people like Magellan, Columbus from their pedestal. We no longer celebrate Columbus Day for obvious reasons.
And the post office.
Huh?
You do if you're the post office.
You do if you're the post office, yes. That's why we sometimes go postal, right? No. But one of the things is, there's the traditional narrative that Europeans are really in the center of everything. So, and that is not entirely true. Especially since the 1980s and 1990s, there's a lot of rethinking going on. There's a book by the name of Reorient, which is really an interesting play with words because it means that you're reorienting something, but of course reorient means you're actually shifting the emphasis away from Europe towards places like Japan and China. And the role of the Europeans coming to China and Japan are now less as they doing the action as they becoming middlemen between the relationship between China and Japan. The main contribution excuse me, of the Europeans is that they create port cities that would become vital trade entrepôts. That's the French term entrepôt. That basically means a strategic port city. And of course the creation of three major ones, Macau, off the coast of China. It's now actually a major casino place. And Macau only reverted back to the People's Republic of China in 1999. And unlike Hong Kong, where the British authorities negotiated a deal with China to give them more political autonomy, the Portuguese, letting go of Macau, basically negotiated casinos and a way of making money. So Macau is still a very important component. See it often in the news. So that's one of the first cities to become part of these entrepôts, these exchange system between Europeans and Chinese and Japanese. The other one is Manila. This is a very important entrepôt that is not in Japan, that is not in China, but is in the Philippines. And we're going to talk more about this city, especially when we turn towards Southeast Asian martial arts, because one of the crucial arts in the Philippines is known as eskrima, which is basically based on European fencing, but mixing in a lot of local influences. So, but Manila is a city developed by the Spanish in the Philippines to become this important exchange hub where silver from the Americas went to Manila and was exchanged for mostly Chinese goods, especially silk, porcelain, and tea. These were, of course, items that then were shipped back to Acapulco, where they were taken overland to the Atlantic coast, were also traded within Mexico, but ultimately made their way back across the Atlantic to Spain and Portugal. So what develops there, and some historians have argued, is a major global exchange through these particular cities. And the one city that is relevant for our context is the southern city of Nagasaki, which is the entrepot, of course, in the Japanese islands. It is here where the Europeans first arrived. First the Spaniards and the Portuguese. Both of them had designs on Japan because of one major item that Japan had to offer, silver. It is interesting to know that a major exchange happened between China and the European middlemen because China required, they had a major tax reform where they're moving away from paper money and using silver as a currency. So China becomes what some historians call the silver drain. They basically require a lot of silver to come in. And this silver, of course, had to be supplied by the middlemen, by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Spanish brought the silver from the Americas. And it's interesting to know, we always think the silver just goes from the Americas across the Atlantic to Europe, but there's also a huge exchange that goes across the Pacific to the Japanese islands and ultimately also China. The Portuguese got most of this silver from Japan. And I mentioned already before, one of the major resources that Japan has is silver, so Nagasaki becomes this major exchange port. The Japanese initially didn't think much of these Europeans when they started arriving. They were bearded, they were sunburned, they had long trips over the ocean, and most importantly, as I mentioned this already before, they didn't smell good because personal hygiene was not high on the agenda of the Spanish and the Portuguese. But it was very offensive in Japanese culture where you have a lot of access to these hot springs, so bodily cleanliness is very much part of your culture. So the Japanese term for these new arrivals was nanban, which basically means barbarians of the south. You know, they don't necessarily come from the south, but since they seemingly come from the southern Pacific to Japan, these are the barbarians from the south that arrive in Nagasaki. So, you know, much like the Europeans had stereotypes about the Chinese and Japanese that they encounter, stereotypes also go the other way. Most of the paintings that you get from this particular time period also depicts Europeans with incredibly big noses, right? So again, the very stereotypical aspects of this. There emerges then an exchange between the Japanese and the Europeans coming in. The Europeans actually have some knowledge, they have they know how to make things, and the Japanese are very interested in what they have to offer. So the most important thing that the Europeans have to offer is gun manufacture. The video I showed you earlier between the Mongols and the samurai showed that gunpowder was known, but most of this was either hurled by hands or hurled by some sort of catapult or trebuchet. Okay, so guns was something completely new. The Japanese hadn't seen this, different way of how to use gunpowder, so they were very much interested in how to make these guns. And again, initially these guns were traded, but the Japanese, who were experts in making samurai swords, these swordsmiths that made these swords very quickly also figured out how to make accurate muskets. In some cases more accurate than what the Europeans had. Okay? So they actually took the technology and made it themselves. Another thing that the Europeans had was, of course, navigation. You know, they had new ships, new ship make. This was something that the Japanese would also be very interested in, and talks about making new ships, incorporating European ship-making techniques into the existing Japanese shipping-making industries, of course, was ongoing. Lastly, cartography. You know, when you're looking at Japanese maps, predating the 1500s and 1600s. They have mostly depictions of Korea, East Asia, but Europeans by now, of course, had circumnavigated the world. They had not the greatest map. This is actually an early map of Japan. Notice not too accurate. Cartography is still in its infancy. But the Europeans certainly had knowledge about the Americas, knowledge about, some of the islands that you have in the Pacific, knowledge about, what Europe and Asia looks like. So again, much of this of interest for the Japanese. And last not least, the Europeans brought in new mining techniques that they had developed. These were not the best mining techniques, I should say. It usually involves using mercury, an extremely poisonous material, to extract silver from the soil. But this was something that, again, the Japanese could use to extract more silver from their own mining industry. In return for all of this knowledge, the Japanese provided some of their resources. Even if they have not a great deal, the Europeans still find some usefulness: gold, silver, and copper. These were, of course, items that, resources that the Japanese could offer in return. So you basically have this major exchange system through the port of Nagasaki that brings these two cultures into contact. By the 1600s, Japan was the second largest global supplier of silver. Of course, the major supplier of silver was the Spanish-controlled Americas. In particular, you probably heard about Potosi, which is a place in Bolivia where most of the silver was extracted using very inhumane practices: mercury, slavery. Potosi is sometimes also referred to as the mountain that ate people because it literally consumed thousands and thousands of lives. Much of this needs to be kept in context. But what we have here is Japan becomes part of this major global exchange system that develops because of the European middlemen arriving. So, and this is a great picture. Of course, here you have a Portuguese or Spanish soldier, but the samurai would still make this new kind of techniques. You still see the two swords that they have right here, which is the old tradition, if you like, but very much this would become part of the new tradition that the samurai soldiers would incorporate as part of their armory. As part of this new process, you actually have a tremendous wealth coming into China. China actually gains from this exchange system, from the Europeans, from the Chinese, from other nations that were part of this. And this sort of wealth also fueled some of the major rivalries that you have already existing in Japan. The outcome is that there's a major contest over who would take over the office of the shogun, the secular ruler of Japan. Notice also that some of the castles that you have in Japan, this is traditional architecture, but because of the developments of cannons and muskets, you now have much stronger defensive walls. How many of you have ever been to a Japanese castle? What is one of the major features of a Japanese castle? Wall, yes, absolutely. You ever tried, to run up the stairs in a castle? Because it's a fascinating, when you...
They're not even?
Excellent. Why they're not even?
Because our bodies have a base pattern for stairs. It's usually, I think, 2 down, 1 up.
Yes.
And if you make them not even, you can't run up them.
Yes.
With
Yes. Actually, as a matter of fact, if you own the castle, you can learn which stairs are the ones that are not uneven, so you can develop a rhythm. It's like, I have to skip a step here. But attackers going into the castle, all of a sudden running up that stair, will become confused, disoriented, bam, easy target. So, these are just fascinating. Also encounters between traditional and modern technology as part of it. Yes.
And the big castle, blanking on the name I went to in Kyoto, also has floorboards that squeak in case the ninjas are trying to sneak in. It will alert people else.
Right. Ninja tradition is, of course, also.
Yeah, another thing we should
Are you going to talk about them? Just build them in. Yes.
Yeah,
You got 3 hours. You can.
we need a whole semester just on Japan.
No, I tell you, we definitely do. So, but to cut a long story short, what you have is a major contest over the shogunship, and you have a number of different local lords who are battling each other. This tradition, which is of course fueled by the new arrival of guns and cannons, really sees what are known in Japanese history as the three unifiers of Japan: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and ultimately Tokugawa Ieyasu would unify all of the Japanese islands under central rule. The central rule would ultimately become known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. Tokugawa Shogunate. And this is something that emerges in the 1600s. Okay. Part of this also meant that you get a new period, the Tokugawa period that lasts between 1600 and 1850. And we'll talk about what happens in 1850. Again, foreigners are to blame for the change of this. Is where the Tokugawa family takes over the shogunate. The emperor sits in Kyoto. The shogun resides in Edo, which would become modern-day Tokyo. And because the Tokugawa dynasty is very much concerned about control of the Japanese islands, you do a couple of things. One is called the alternative residence, and that's a nice way of saying it's a hostage system. That part of the family, from the noblemen all across the Japanese islands, have to reside in Edo. So the shogun has an eye on them, and there will be no uprising happening throughout the Japanese islands. The other thing that, and this is very ironic, and this is part of your readings, Japan will give up the gun. You know, as a matter of fact, I mean, there will still be gun technology around of Japan, but guns are mostly outlawed. It's a form of control. So, you know, other cultures will develop, maintain the gun. In the Tokugawa period, you actually have these new weapons being filtered out. Okay. What this leads to is, of course, tremendous periods of stability. There's little warfare. There's some crime, obviously. You have that in all societies. But warfare is pretty much giving way to peace, an extensive period of peace that also triggers a tremendous period of economic growth. And it's this economic growth, of course, that Japan could use to ultimately propel themselves into the 20th century. As a result of this is the cities become much larger. You have, of course, now the development of Osaka, Tokyo, Kyoto, becoming these massive population centers that you see today. And there's also the development of a cultural practice known as the floating world, which involves a lot of different artistic expressions that you see here, depicted here. So in some ways, Tokugawa Japan stops the development, but at the same time, there's a lot of things going on underneath. One of the most important development is that the samurai class, that was so central to the unification of Japan, will actually lose its status. Because you no longer have war. They're still there patrolling, but they will slowly be eclipsed by an increasingly rising merchant class. So you have a clash, a classical, should I use the term Karl Marx, clash of classes between the samurai, who are the official powerful class of pre-Tokugawa Japan, with the new classes, because of economic growth, that are becoming much, much more powerful. And then, of course, you still have these pesky foreigners coming in, especially Spanish and Portuguese. And Spanish and Portuguese, they have many aims, of course. One is to make money, and lots of it. Another one is to bring Roman Catholicism. You know, as they're moving into Japan, you have a massive upheaval happening in Europe. It is known as the Protestant Reformation, where you basically have a split between the church into Catholic and Protestant church. The term Protestant already suggests that the Protestants are protesting against the abuses of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has to undertake what is known as a major reform. And out of this reform comes a new class of missionaries. These missionaries are known as the Jesuits. And how much time do I have? Let me just say a few things about Jesuits. Jesuits emphasize learning. Some of the best educational institutions in this country, for instance Georgetown, are universities created by Jesuits. These are places of higher learning, because the Jesuits are supposed to be getting the best education possible. But once they leave the education system, the Jesuits are humbled. They have to deal with the dying, with the sick, because somebody so highly educated at the same time also needs to be humbled. So you have both this tremendous education, but it's also a humbling experience, to make him into hardened missionaries. Jesuits are best characterized by black robes. You can find it over here. And one of the best known missionaries who was active in most of Asia, including China, India, but also Japan, opened up a Jesuit mission frontier, especially in the southern island of Kyushu. And many of the southern island rulers, the daimyo, the local lords, would ultimately end up converting to the new religion coming in. It is estimated that by the time Japan is unified in 1600, the Jesuits have about 300,000 converts among the Japanese, which is similar to what they have in China. Again, measured on the total population, that is a small percentage, but still a significant inroad that these Jesuits are making. And because of this, the Tokugawa shogun, the shogun of Japan, becomes increasingly suspicious of this foreign influences coming in. Especially, there is a major Christian uprising. As Christianity is sort of curtailed in Japan, there's a major Christian uprising that occurred in 1638, known as the Shimbara uprising, that was ultimately crushed by the Tokugawa shogunate. But as a result of this, the Tokugawa regime basically said, no more missionaries, no more Christian missionaries, out. It also stops the Spanish and the Portuguese from coming in, asks the ones that are residing in Japan to either shift their loyalties or to get out. And there's a number of edicts that are passed in the 1600s. They're known as the Sakuku edicts, to basically prevent people from leaving Japan and also to prevent foreigners from coming in. Sometimes the Sakuku edicts are called the closed country edicts, but Japan was never a closed country. You can't cut off 7,000 islands from the rest of the world. And there's a big tradition in Japan, I mentioned this earlier, of pirates, smugglers, and all of this is still going. Okay, so, but it's an attempt by the Tokugawa regime to basically control these foreigners. And there's one particular agency of foreigners that you allow to still trade. And again, this is in the port of Nagasaki. There's an artificial man-made island, sort of fan-shaped island, known as Deshima. And this is given to the one country that basically says, we don't want to convert you, but we want to trade with you. And those are the Dutch. The Dutch are the last ones to come in. The Dutch are tightly controlled. As you can see, they're living in this island, but the only point of access is a very small gate into Japan. But this small gate is enough for a transfer of knowledge. The Dutch actually learn a lot about the Japanese, about Japanese culture, and in return, there's also a knowledge of the wider world. This is known by historians as Dutch learning. As the Dutch are bringing in, especially in the 1700s, ideas of the Enlightenment, new ideas that are circulating, medicine, science, and all of these things are still coming into Japan. So Japan is not entirely closed off. This is a window to the rest of the world. And this window is important. It's important because the foreigners would come back, this time with a vengeance, and this time the foreigners could not be stopped because you have once again a major wave of technological innovations. The most important technological innovation that you have, of course, in the 19th century is, well, first you have the development of a new country. Yes, the United States is independent since 1776, or should I say, you claim to be independent since 1776 because the war goes on a while longer. And ultimately, Great Britain will cede that country, the 13 original colonies. But if you're looking at the 13 original colonies of the United States, They're all located on the East Coast. The Pacific really is a non-entity for most Americans. But there's a lot of developments that will change this. Most importantly, a number of wars. The Mexican-American War, that will ultimately add a huge section of Mexico to the United States and will make this place, California, part of the United States, and all of a sudden the United States have a huge Pacific frontier. With this, of course, you have also the economic might of the United States going into the Pacific. The most important economic branch that the United States uses to go into the Pacific is, of course, whaling, the whaling industry. You know, here you have the novels of Moby Dick as a good example. As a matter of fact, 25% of the crews on American whaling ships are probably Pacific Islanders, because it's not an easy job. There's a lot of jumping ship, a lot of people running away, and trying to live the life of Pacific Islanders. That works sometimes, sometimes it doesn't. What happens is that these whaling ships also touch upon Japan, because there are just a few very successful whaling grounds around the Pacific, and whaling is seasonal. You follow the whales around, and during a particular time period, these whalers are outside of the Japanese islands. Some of these whalers jump ship. Some of the whalers actually hit a rock and become castaway. The ship sinks. And here's the thing. Japanese authorities don't treat the whalers very well. They don't care whether they're American, Russian, all kinds of other nationalities. But the issue is they're usually imprisoned, beaten, frequently not returned to the authorities. And that's something that makes the United States, especially becoming a major world power after the Mexican-American War, extremely upset. So they decide to send a mission. The mission went out in 1853, and the mission is, for the first time, using new ships. These are actually hybrid ships. They still use sails. They still use wind, the traditional way of how to cross the ocean, but they also use coal. They also use steam. Yes.
Are those the designs that came from the Indian Ocean?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, actually bring a good point. Yes, the designs that you have are mostly European designs. The first major steamships using the ocean appear by the 1840s. One of the problems is when you're looking at the first steamship powered, you probably have seen paddle wheelers, right? These ships that they're not good for the ocean, for obvious reason. You know, wave hits the paddle wheel, it just falls apart. So you actually had to go through several instances of developing the mechanism underneath the ship, so it's protected from the waves, and that was a major way, and you're making them more efficient. The first steamships were so tremendously inefficient that you had no cargo space, because they used as much coal as you could store in them. As a matter of fact, the very first steamship, they had to use everything that was wood to actually make it across the ocean. So whether the deck chairs, whether the deck, whatever, they just had to put it in. But as we move into the 1850s, they become more efficient. They use less coal, and because they use less coal, you can actually transport things there and other things. But most importantly, what is most important about these ships is, of course, they can be armored. In other words, you can put steel on top of them. I mean, the first major ironclads battles you have during the American Civil War, that's a little later. And you can use much more powerful guns. What you have developing also in the 1853, again, I don't have time to go into this, but it's a major turn of weaponry. The muskets, we can go back here, that you see in the 1500s and 1600s are now replaced, well, first by rifling, right? During the American Revolution, you make them more accurate, but they're still muskets. But the newest invention by the 1850 is the development of breech loaders. Basically, you combine bullet and powder, and you put it, that's why we call it breech loaders, in the rear of the rifle. The advantage of that is you can load them much faster. Loading a musket usually takes 45 to 60 seconds. You can get one shot off, maybe a minute, if you're fast. But with a breech loader, you can shoot 6 to 10 bullets a minute. Okay? And that's a major breakthrough. The same thing is developing cannons. Notice that cannons by the early 1800s, when you're looking at, I don't know, the Napoleonic Wars, are usually, or the pirates, right? Pirates of the Caribbean, right? You load the big bullet, big cannonball in front. You put the pouch in the back, you light it, and then it shoots out. By the 1850s, cannons become also breech loaders. So you combine the powder and the cannon, and you load it in the breech of, and you can load it much, much faster, and it's much safer. All of this means that when Commodore Perry shows up in Japan, he brings this new wave of technology. And also, I should say, a new sense of what America is. Most people have argued that before 1848, America is a country that's very much concerned about continental expansion. By the time this very country reaches the Pacific Ocean, America is becoming now a Pacific power that measures itself with Spain, with Russia, with Great Britain, with other rising powers, the Germans, the French. And it basically becomes who gets to places first. So the castaway are used as an excuse. The treatment of the whalers are used as an excuse to send this mission, and the mission was really there to open up Japan, to put demands on Japan. And the result of this, I mean, initially, and you see Perry here meeting with, of course, the samurai. Perry basically says, if you don't agree, I'll put this mildly here, but if you don't agree to my terms, I'm going to turn my guns on Edo, Tokyo, and I'm going to open fire. I'm going to show you the effectiveness of this new technology. So Japan has to forcefully open up its ports, and it results in a number of unequal treaties. Unequal treaties because they're unequal because they give America all the advantage, while Japan doesn't really have a whole lot of advantage. The biggest thing that upsets the Japanese, Gesundheit, what upsets the Japanese is really this sort of notion that if a crime is committed by an American in Japan, this American cannot be tried by the Japanese, but only by other Americans. Okay? It's called extraterritoriality. It's very upsetting, because you're basically saying your law is not good for us. We don't accept it. This happens in China, this happens in Japan. The difference between China and Japan is that the Japanese will do something about it. So,
Reiner, it's interesting because this is still an issue we're in our near where we have our military bases in Japan.
Absolutely.
The Japanese are still very upset when somebody from the military base commits a crime and then they're tried by the military, not the Japanese courts.
Yes, and that's a very good point, especially rape.
Yeah.
And that's, yes, absolutely. Although I should say that this is not based on the treaties that Commodore Perry,
Right.
but it's much, it has to do with World War II
Right.
and unconditional surrender of Japan. But you're absolutely right. So let me just play a little bit here about Perry and the encounter with the Japanese to set the stage for what happens.
Upon hearing the news, the shogun immediately fell ill. Many said from the shock of hearing that a foreign naval squadron was at his doorstep. His advisors tried to deal with the crisis.
Fresh messages arrived one after the other. The situation seemed so sudden, so formidable, and so important. Orders were issued to the great clans to keep strict watch, as if it were possible that these barbarian vessels might proceed to acts of violence.
In a desperate show of force, the shogunate sent a squadron of guard boats to surround the American ships. The Japanese officer ordered the ships to leave. Their commander, Commodore Matthew C. Perry, ignored him.
I was well aware that the more exclusive I should make myself, and the more exacting I might be, the more respect these people of forms and ceremonies would award me.
5,000 samurai warriors armed with swords and antiquated cannons lined the shores. Again, their chief officer commanded Perry, leave Edo Bay immediately. The Commodore refused.
I endeavor to inculcate the idea that the government of the United States is superior in power and influence to Japan. The honor of the nation calls for it, and the interest of commerce demands it.
The Japanese on shore watched as Perry's crews readied for action. Cannons were loaded, guns were drawn. Perry came ashore. Perry presented his papers and delivered his ultimatum. He would be back, and he expected Japan to comply with America's demand to open the country for trade. If not, he was prepared to take Japan by force. He would return in the spring for his answer. Then he and his squadron left Edo Bay.
Their deportment and manner of expressions were exceedingly arrogant, and the resulting insult to our national dignity was not small. Those who heard could but gnash their teeth and suffer this insult in silence. After the barbarians had retired, a certain person drew his sword and slashed to bits a portrait of their leader, Perry.
There was great fear of Perry. There were the portraits of Perry as a devil. There were the portraits of his ships belching fire. All of this served to whip up, near hysteria on the part of portions of the Japanese populace. At the same time, there's fascination. There's fascination with Perry. There's fascination with these ships, these enormous ships that hadn't been seen before. There's fascination with the technological prowess of the Americans.
To complicate matters, the shogun had died, and the new shogun was mentally unfit. His advisors took charge, but they could not reach agreement.
The head of the shogunate decides that he is going to poll all of the daimyo in Japan. What should the shogunate do? This is a radical break with tradition. The authority of the shogunate is to deal with foreign relations. The title of the shogun, of course, is the great barbarian quelling generalissimo. And yet here is the head of the shogunate asking the daimyo what he should do. Two positions are staked out, one being known as the open the country argument.
The Americans do not understand the ethics of humanity and justice. There will be no choice but to start trade with them.
The other side being revere the emperor and expel the barbarian.
The Americans have come to seize Japan. Therefore, if we don't drive them away now, the other foreign powers will follow. We are in a dangerous situation.
While the debate raged, the shogunate remained indecisive. The end of the year was filled with half-hearted compromises and inadequate attempts at coastal defense. Then, in February, Perry returned earlier than expected. This time, his show of force was even more ominous. He arrived with double the ships and crew. The honor of the Japanese had been challenged, but they had no means to defend it. Their only hope lay in negotiation. As soon as Perry came ashore, the talks began. They went on into the night and for the next 23 days. In the end, the treaty was a compromise, which served both countries' interests.
Perry got what he wanted, which was to establish a relationship between Japan and the United States. The shogunate got what it wanted in not surrendering its control over foreign relations and opening Japan up to unregulated trade. I'm not sure that the shogunate has been given enough credit for choosing peace over war. And you can say that the shogunate chose to open up relations with America and the West out of weakness, but it didn't have to. The shogunate took the practical decision, and they chose peace, and thereby preserved the integrity and territorial sovereignty of their country.
Before signing the treaty with Perry, the shogun arranged a social evening, a prerequisite for conducting business in Japan that continues to this day. Sumo wrestlers displayed their strength. The first one invited Perry to punch him in the stomach. Another wrestler hoisted 2 huge bags of rice over his head to show his strength. Perry offered champagne and whiskey. He gave the Japanese gifts. Among those of particular interest, a telegraph, a camera, and a quarter-scale steam railroad, unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. Japanese engineers would quickly make plans to replicate them. Three days later, the agreement was signed. It was not long before Japan signed trade agreements with Russia, England, France, and Holland. Despite its accommodation to the West, the days of the Tokugawa dynasty were numbered. No longer was the warrior class to control the destiny of Japanese society. Within 10 years, the samurai were officially disbanded. But the samurai ethic had been indelibly engraved into Japanese culture. In 1868, the 15th shogun stepped down. With his departure, 265 years of rule by the Tokugawa family had come to an end. The modern era of Japan had begun.
Okay. So that's just a little bit background on Perry, and shows you also a little bit the historical debate that's going on here. The person that you saw there interviewed, he's a major scholar at Emory University, a very young, very, one of these new interpretation of things where he basically says the shogunate did the right thing by giving unto the Americas and was still able to negotiate. The more traditional ones are that the shogunate actually demonstrated weakness. And because of this, what the video showed you really nicely, his name is Tonio Andrade, by the way, if you want to look him up. He writes like fantastic stuff, also a wonderful historical writer. He basically, what we have here is these two factions. The one that basically said, well, let's keep the old system, let's get the shogunate intact. But it turns out that the damage is done. There's the perception that something new needs to be done. And what is new is something that happens in 1868. It's called the Meiji Restoration. And you still, before 1868, you still have the dual system. You have a shogun, mostly responsible for the secular, dealing with the foreigners and all of these things, and you have the emperor, who is very far removed, who only really deals with the sacred. What the Meiji Restoration means is that the power is restored to the emperor. So in other words, you move the power away from the shogun and give the emperor now both the secular and the sacred. Emperor Meiji, the term is enlightened rule, basically is a young person who takes this charge very seriously, and he seeks to reform his own country. One of the big debates that happens in Japan, and this is actually a debate that is not unique to Japan because it's a debate that happens in China, it's a debate that happens in the Ottoman Empire, in all of these major empires that are now threatened by this new technology, by America, by the other Europeans. And the big debate is, should we modernize or should we westernize? Because those terms are not the same. Do we modernize, but based on our cultural principles? Or should we become just like the West? And to cut a long story short, everybody says, we're going to borrow something from the West, but we're not going to become like them. The Chinese would call this beat the Bavarians by basically borrowing from the Bavarians. Unfortunately, in China, it doesn't work out that well. We don't have time to get into this, but in Japan it really works. Because Japan basically becomes a modernized nation after 1868. And by the time Emperor Meiji dies in 1912, Japan is a fully industrialized country. There is problems with this industrialization. The problem is that you have displacement of population, all of the problems that you see happening, let's say in Germany and England, because of this rapid industrialization are also problems that you see in Japan. Most importantly, however, is there's also dissatisfaction among the old elite, the samurai. And this dissatisfaction ultimately erupts in a major uprising that occurs among some of the last samurai. And I'm not going to show you the movie because it's horrible. It's not horrible, but it's not that good. You know, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. Why Tom Cruise always gets to play these roles? I'm not sure. But, you know, I mean, the point here is that this uprising is ultimately squashed because the samurais are using mostly traditional weapons. Well, after 1861, what Japan does, it looks at other countries and finds that the German army, and although Germany is not yet a unified country, the Prussian army is a great model to follow. General conscription, everybody wearing the same uniforms. Everybody has this new technology, the breech-loading rifles. And you can see of this, of course, in the movie The Last Samurai, that ultimately you have this last charge of the samurai against breech-loading rifles and machine guns, and the outcome is logic, that the samurais will be crushed by this. So in comes the new. But even the new gets filtered through Japanese values. I mean, the emperor is still divine. Okay, there's still a link to Amaterasu. So you have selective borrowing. You like Germany, like the army, that's good. One thing that you like about Germany too is that you have a constitution that allows for a parliament but keeps the emperor still centrally in place. This is something the Japanese like too. This is great, you know. Democracy stuff that America's bringing in, that's too soon, too soon. The other thing, look at Britain. Great, the British Navy. We'll, of course, model ourselves after them. We built some of these new ships that Admiral Perry brought into Edo Bay. We're going to make this our own. And then there's other things that you borrow from the US. Not so much a political system, not the checks and balances, but you know, you look at every single nation and you just borrow what you find useful and you reject what is not. So out of this, of course, comes a very fastly turnaround country. Modernization theorists, those are the guys that actually emphasize why countries become modern, like to use the case of Japan because it's a non-Western modernization. It's one of the few cases, successful cases, where a non-Western nation stood up to the West and not only was able to borrow from the West, but as we move into the late 19th century and early 20th century, Japan is able to join the West. And what you have, of course, is a number of conflicts. Excuse me. What is important to remember here is a turnaround. Well, the first part of this class, I spoke about how important Chinese influences are on Japan. But all of a sudden, Japan realizes that this is no longer the same relationship. Japan is no longer the bigger brother. China is no longer the bigger brother and Japan is the smaller brother. But that relationship has been turned upside down because of modernization. And this becomes very obvious when China and Japan start clashing over who was going to control the Korean peninsula, just across of the Tsushima Strait. This conflict would ultimately balloon into a war, the Sino-Japanese War. And again, this is a particular Japanese woodcut, but it shows the more modern style Japanese soldiers that are using also modern technology, fighting a more outdated army that has not modernized to the same effect. So Japan, even if traditionally Japan is considered the smaller brother, is able to defeat the bigger brother. And the relationship is turned upside down. As a consequence of this, Japan now starts taking the Korean peninsula, not formally annexing it, but using it as a protectorate. Korea comes under our wing. Also, as a part of this, the Japanese will start expanding to Taiwan, the island of Taiwan. So you see the development here for the first time of a Japanese empire that is no longer just concentrated on the Japanese islands, but now becomes something bigger. At the same time that this is happening, there are other nations who take note that Japan is becoming a powerful nation. So one nation in particular that really takes notice is, of course, the British. The British are very much concerned about the growing Russian presence in East Asia, so they sign a treaty, an Anglo-Japanese agreement in 1902. This is, again, a fantastic depiction of two ways of bringing countries together. That is Amaterasu, the sun goddess we talked about, and this is Britannia, the sort of personification of the British Empire. Basically now standing shoulder to shoulder and starting to rule most of the Eastern Pacific. Again, most of this agreement was done by the British to basically keep two other powers out, Russia and Germany, because Germany was starting a major naval race with Great Britain at the same time. And because of this, the British would start supporting the Japanese. Technology exchange would happen, but also information would happen, and this would become very, very important, as in 1904, Japan and a European country would have a clash. The clash is mostly over very resource-rich Manchuria. Again, Japan is a country that's now industrializing. They don't have a lot of natural resources. You're trying to find them elsewhere. What happens is the Russo-Japanese War. And most of the Russo-Japanese War, it's often neglected in history because most people say it's basically a precursor of World War I. You get, for the first time, trench warfare. You had trench warfare before, but really much of what you see in the Russo-Japanese War is basically what would happen 10 years later in 1914. To cut a long story short, the Russians will be defeated by the Japanese. And it will ultimately be your president, Roosevelt, Teddy, not FDR, who would jump in and would negotiate a peace treaty, whereby now Japan had free reign over vast territories of China, and the Russians will be kept under control. There were a number of encounters between the Russians and the Japanese. Some were fought in Manchuria, in the trenches, but perhaps the most important maritime battle was between the Russians and the Japanese, and is known as the Battle of Tsushima, because it took place once again in a very strategic, narrow strait between the Korean peninsula and the Japanese islands. So let me play a little bit of that. Battle of Tsushima. right, Battle of Tsushima. Again, the subtitles are not the best, but I like the videos because it gives you a nice impression. We obviously don't have footage from the actual battle because cameras are still in their infancy. But the Battle of Tsushima also shows the amount of learning that's going on here, because I mentioned U.S. influences on Japan. One of the most read book among the Japanese Navy is a book written by an American historian / naval officer called Mahan, who talks about sea power, and basically arguing that the nation that controls the sea will ultimately control the destiny of the world. I mean, this would be a thinking that very much would prevail until World War II. After that, of course, that would shift, because in most of World War II, surface vessels, especially these sort of big battleships that you saw here, would no longer have the same impact when you introduce aircraft carriers. So, but again, the Japanese are learning and are using this into practice, and are now able to defeat. And this is what really gets the Europeans. Russia is considered a European power. And the notion among the Europeans is no Asian or African country can defeat another European power. That is impossible. You know, and again, it forces a rethinking. Because, you know, Europeans have this deep ingrained racism against other people outside of Europe. But, you know, the Battle of Tsushima, as well as the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War, forces a rethinking. And you see now that European powers are willing to enter into agreements with Japan. So what is the result of this? When World War I finally breaks out, in August of 1914, the Japanese evoke the Anglo-Japanese Agreement of 1902 and rush south into an area that's controlled by Germany. These are the islands of Micronesia, islands of the Caroline Islands, places like the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, and basically take out the German forces there. I'm smiling because the statistics tell us that the Germans have 14 colonial officials in all of Micronesia. Not much of a match, so it's not really a battle. What the Germans are doing is basically this, as soon as they see the Japanese ships coming into port. So, but as a consequence, the Japanese government is expanding deeper and deeper into the Pacific. After the war is over, the Japanese actually get Micronesia as not as a colony, but it's called a mandate. They basically take it over, and would ultimately develop these islands into outposts that will be used, of course, to enter that last phase, a phase that most of you are familiar with if you watch the movies The Pacific. You know, why does Japan become such a formidable opponent? Much of this, again, has to do with shifts in industrialization. While Japan has a lot of coal, by the time you move into the 20th century, coal is no longer the most important thing. We're now moving to oil. And Japanese is a very oil-poor country. But there are many oil-producing countries, most importantly the Dutch Indonesia, Dutch-controlled Indonesia. So when the Japanese are trying to get the resources, again, I'm not trying to apologize for the expansion here, but to get the resources, much of this is done in an effort to kick the Europeans out. By the 1930s, the Japanese would develop a new concept. It was called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. A thinly veiled attempt to hide their own colonial or imperial ambitions by saying all Asians should cooperate. And this is a post that was made shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And you basically have the Japanese soldier ripping apart the chains kept by the Europeans, Americans, Britain, D for the Dutch. So you basically, just rip apart the chains of control. In fact, however, as we very well know, is that the Japanese had a tiered system that kept the Japanese on top and other Asians as sort of partners, but not necessarily on an equal scale. This sort of expansion into Asia, especially into China, was of course something that would bring the United States and Japan on the major coalition course. One good thing that happened, that would ultimately lead to new technology, was an agreement between all major naval powers in the 1920s. It was called the Washington Agreement, to basically limit the number of surface vessels each country could have. On one hand, that was a good thing, but it also meant that many of the vessels that were already under construction could not be used. So by the 1920s, people came up with a new idea. You take all the cannons and all the major turrets of the vessels and build a flat surface and create a new technological innovation known as the aircraft carrier. That would, of course, dominate warfare in the 1940s. So why, again, I'm not trying to apologize for what happened in the crimes against Chinese and the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the conflict between the US and Japan was pretty much, I don't want to say inevitable. Nothing is ever inevitable. But as Japan was pushing to get more resources, the United States was trying to prevent Japan from obtaining oil. By December of 1941, Japan played a major risk card. The notion was to take out one of the nerve centers of the United States, located on the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. Most of the American surface fleet was stationed at Pearl Harbor. Fortunately for the Americans, most of their aircraft carriers were not. So they were unharmed after this attack, and that, of course, would shape the battles to follow. You know the outcome of this one, so I don't have to talk about it. So I'm done, unless you have any other questions.